My name is David Daniel Ball. I am writing a research paper, and this is a narrative that I intend the paper to hang off. And I intend to do the research that supports this and discover whether the narrative is right or whether the narrative needs to be improved. What were the reasons for African Americans transitioning from support for the Republicans to support for the Democrats? When did it happen? Who were the persons behind the transition? Was it a response to policy or to a promise of policy? Had behavior of Democrats to black people changed following the Civil War? Had the behavior of Republicans changed to black people? Were there material benefits for black people from the shift in support? We start with 40 acres and a mule. Immediately following the Civil War, reparations intended for former slaves were prepared when General Sherman declared 40 acres of land for former slaves. The intention was segregated communities with black peoples governing themselves, and the only white people in the communities might be soldiers bivouacked to protect black peoples. The policy was soon called 40 acres and a mule. Land was set aside, but the new Democrat president, Andrew Johnson, rescinded the order, and the KKK came into being, lynching black peoples. The Compromise of 1877. President U.S. Grant attempted Reconstruction in the South, but towards the end of his time in office with Democrat control of the Senate from 1875, Reconstruction was given over to state rules and Jim Crow laws. Federal troops were withdrawn. Democrat Senate control followed voter fraud carried about by Democrats supporting white supremacists in 1874 and after, with the 1898 Wilmington insurrection being related. Booker T. Washington. Washington was a former slave whose leadership made him an advocate for former slaves. Washington did not fall into the trap of using race to promote equality, but he inspired Martin Luther King with his 1895 Atlanta Compromise, where he said that American exceptionalism, that's my phrasing, would allow black Americans to rise and obtain what was theirs. The fruit of Washington's agenda was seen in the success of Black Wall Street, as well as elsewhere, but the tragedy of Black Wall Street was to play out in 1921. Woodrow Wilson probably would never have been president but for division in the Republicans. President Taft was a different conservative to President Theodore Roosevelt. Wilson got elected as the two conservatives fought over their issues. Taft would later become appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States. Once elected, Wilson held his constituency by promising to keep the United States out of World War I. Once re-elected, Wilson sent U.S. troops to Europe. Wilson used his position to bungle the peace terms in 1919, but of relevance to this article is Wilson's of sending the successor to Booker T. Washington, Robert Russa Moton, to Europe to oversee on black U.S. troops. Moton found racism was an issue and got a promise from Wilson that something could be done. But before anything was done, Wilson was no longer president and Democrats were out of office. Robert Russa Moton. Moton's grandfather was an African tribal chief and slaver who was caught and sold into slavery. Moton was not satisfied with Booker Washington's position as stated in the 1895 Atlanta Compromise. Jim Crow laws in the South, brutal lynchings and terrible abuses of power needed to be addressed. Moton chose to try and address them through the Democrat Party, which was perpetrating them by first exacting promises from Wilson, then FDR. There was room to maneuver within the Dems, where the Republicans had roadblocks in the South. But Moton was pragmatic and would first turn to Herbert Hoover to make changes. Herbert Hoover was a civil engineer who was famous for feeding Europe following World War I. Hoover was called on to provide aid following the 1927 Mississippi flood, which devastated several states. While doing so, many atrocities occurred relating to white supremacists stealing from black peoples. Hoover was incensed and wanted to prosecute those involved. He was advised by his handlers that it would be better for him to handle it as president and have a stronger impact. Moton supported the idea and viewed it as a promise. Hoover became one of the most popularly elected presidents of all time. However, once elected came the Wall Street crash. Hoover became hamstrung on state rights, and Moton felt betrayed. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a Democrat Party machine chief. We do not know what role he played in atrocities like the 1921 Black Wall Street tragedy or the atrocities with the 1927 Mississippi flood. FDR approached Moton over a policy he had addressing the Wall Street crash, called the New Deal. Moton wanted Jim Crow laws removed and civil rights to be equal. FDR offered welfare. It wasn't a promise Hoover could deliver on, as it meant a vast increase on spending, when previous administrations had cut spending. Moton signed up. Now, there are aspirations of black people. Following the Civil War, former slaves had a dysfunctional society without fathers for some families and with poor educational attainment. By the 1920s, black people were improving in their prosperity. But by the 1990s, following equal rights and following the New Deal, we see the black community is very badly fractured, with many single-parent families and with lots of indicators of poverty. I'm hoping to take a look at what the indicators are of prosperity and poverty as we see these policies being implemented, and that will be the basis of my research. Maybe my narrative is correct, maybe my narrative is wrong and needs to be adjusted. I wait and see, and I value input from people from outside. Please get in touch with me if you have something that you would like to add. My name is David Daniel Ball, and you can follow me on Facebook or on Rumble or in any of many, many different places.